We're getting close to the end. We got 4 or 5 more classes. We've only got 2 more classes, I think, in Psalms. And this morning we're going to look at Psalms 139 and Psalms 141. These Psalms in particular are going to go over some particular language around God's presence, His omniscience, His role in our life. David takes a very introspective role and approach in these particular Psalms, and he looks at some very interesting things in his own life, recognizing God's rule, God's power, and God's presence in his own life. We're going to start off by just reading the first 5 verses here. And Jay, would you read the first 5 verses of Psalm 139?
Absolutely. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me.
So David really comes out swinging in these first 5 verses in terms of opening up his thoughts and his ideas of how God is ruling in his life, the things that God has a hand in his life. I love verse 2 here, and he says, you know when I sit down and when I rise up, you understand my thought from afar. He automatically recognizes God's presence in his life, and particularly his omnipresence in a number of different things here, poetically. It's interesting, I think, there's reference particularly, I think, to the New Testament in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 30 when it talks about God knowing every hair on our head. There's certainly a lot of similarities, I think, in the Psalms and what we see in the New Testament. There's definitely that in these first 5 verses here. What's something that maybe stands out to you in these first 5 verses about David acknowledging some of David's acknowledgments here? Anything that stands out in how David approaches these first initial verses in Psalms?
The first verse right there, that God pursues us, is really powerful and I think good to meditate on. Like he searches, you search me and know me. He pursues us.
Yeah, absolutely. What else?
He sees that obviously as a gift that some people try to run from God, but David is opening himself up. He realizes there's nothing he can't hide, he can't run. So he's fully being vulnerable, and he sees that as a blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think David, particularly, he's one of the characters in the Bible that has maybe the most self-awareness of any other individual when I think of in the Bible. And I think these first 5 verses just really display that. It's interesting how he acknowledges that God doesn't just know everything about me, David as a person, but he knows me at a very deep level. He has searched me, tried me. He knows my heart. He knows the words that are in my head before they even come out. We're going to see that down here in some other verses. David just really thinks about all the things that God could possibly know about him and recognizes that it's beyond really his comprehension. One idea that I think is really interesting is, it can be uncomfortable today to know that certain people are watching us, right? We think about the world we live in digitally. There's so many, every building you walk into, there's 1,000 cameras, right? Every time you go someplace, you're likely being recorded. But that doesn't necessarily fill us with a sense of, confidence or makes us feel good about ourselves. Why is that? Why do you think it's uncomfortable to be watched?
Well, because there's always scrutiny, right? So
Yeah.
when I read through this before, you think, man, God's he's got his eye on me. It's like somebody watching, waiting for you to slip up. Kind of like the video cameras when you walk into a store to make sure you don't, pick something up and put it in the bag, or do something. That's the purpose of those video cameras.
Yeah.
Is to look for evidence of something that's been done wrong. But I don't think that that's what David is getting across here. It's not that same level of scrutiny, even though there is judgment involved at times. As you get further on into the psalm, I think we'll see that that's actually very comforting for David.
Yeah, it's not an incriminating type of approach where he's watching us for us to make a wrong move. If I think about this idea throughout literature, there's this idea in the Lord of the Rings of the Eye of Sauron watching us at all times. That's not what David's talking about here. But yet, so oftentimes, that's what gives us an aversion, I think, to the mass surveillance that we have in today's world, because we don't know the intentions of the people watching those things. We don't know why we're being watched, or we don't at least have a good understanding, or we don't appreciate what their intentions are. We don't kindly. I'd say we're skeptics. Maybe we're skeptics is the best way to put it. But with God, right, we know that at the end of the day, that's not his intentions. God's not that way with us in our lives. And I think it's very interesting that in these first 5 verses here, we see that, and David acknowledges that God is always watching out for our good. He's not searching us or watching us in order to wait for us to make a mistake or something like that we have in today's world. Any other thoughts or comments around that? All right, moving on to verse 6 here. David says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high, I cannot attain it." David recognizes that God's grasp is far beyond his own, right? He details how God knows the very, thoughts in his head. He understands what his actions are as he's walking around on the earth. And I think such knowledge it goes beyond his comprehension at this point. He recognizes that God has a level of dominion over him that he does not have, that man does not have, and he appreciates it. And I think that in this psalm particularly, he lets us know that. And it's hard for us to accept that, I think, sometimes today, maybe. It's difficult for us to accept that somebody can have that level of control over us, that level of knowledge over us. When I think about the things that man has done in the world today, we oftentimes puff ourselves up to be something very high. But David here is very humble and very acknowledging of the fact that God's wisdom is beyond our own. His ways are beyond our own. This is a common theme that we see throughout Psalms, something that we've seen in Job when we studied Job. And David definitely has a very humble spirit here. Moving on now, let's go ahead and read verses 7 through 12. Seth, would you mind reading verse 7 through 12?
Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you.
I don't know what inspired these particular verses from David, but when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think, he's really evoking the sense of God's omnipresence here, and the fact that he's with him wherever he goes. There's nowhere on the earth that he can hide from God. And, we see throughout Samuel and the book of Kings the idea of David having to hide in caves, being chased. He's been in some very desolate places throughout his life. He's been in some very harrowing circumstances where he's had men after him for his life. He's been unsure of, what his life will become. And, I couldn't help but think he maybe was in a cave in a dark place thinking about these things or reflecting on those times when he was and inspiring some of these words here. Any thoughts about these particular 5 verses? What maybe is something that you take away from David's language here?
Hey, Elliot, I like your point about David historically running away from and hiding people like Saul, because he was able to successfully do that. But he knows he can't do that with God. So, it's like if you had to go on trial, you could realistically like run away from the police and not get arrested. But you're on trial with God. Like, you know that He's there looking at you. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't avoid it like Jonah. So he knows that he just might as well come to Him honestly. So there's either you're standing in front of Him in the right or in the wrong. So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. David, like I mentioned earlier, he has so much self-awareness. He knows that there's nowhere he can go, that God is not going to be with him, or God's not going to see him or know him. God knows every one of His creation. He knows everything that He does, and David's not beyond that.
Elliot, the point you're making, I think this is critical. We keep seeing this in this Psalms. Lawrence has made this point over the years. Well, why is Scripture written the way it is? Really, mainly through the lives of people. Not just as some series of do this, don't do this. But I think that's for us to really think about it, identify with these people. Now, it's not always easy. David lived 3,000 years ago, and in one way we've become so familiar with the stories of David but like you were saying, you start thinking about, for 10 years he was running from Saul and having to live in caves in the wilderness. He had to live with his enemies. He lived with the Philistines. And like you said, it strikes me not so much as God's watching us to judge us, but David seems to be reflecting, when I was with the Philistines, when I was in the cave, or wherever I might go, you are and will still be there. And I think, we can see that in others, but the more we can draw from his experiences, because often when we're in dark places or alone, it becomes very personal, and it becomes very easy to isolate our experiences from those of others. And I think the more we can draw from it, the more the Scripture really helps us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similar in some of the points, but when I think about this verse and some of the other verses in the Psalm about pursuing us, it reminds me of that new song that we're learning here, the song, the goodness of God. It talks about, your goodness is running after me. And, you contrast that with Satan, the devil. We know that he's pursuing us as well. They're both in a same pursuit. So what a comfortable feeling, to know that, we've got a God who's chasing after us, who wants to, keep us filled up. It's a really encouraging verse.
Yeah, absolutely. David even says here, in this particular section, he says, in Sheol, his presence is felt. And it's very much a hyperbole in some way of the fact that there's no place possibly that we can go that removes us from His presence, that God cannot reach us, God cannot be there. And I think that David does such a good job of describing those feelings, particularly everything that you said, Brian, in a much more eloquent fashion. That's exactly the thing I'm trying to get across, is that at the end of the day, it's us who removes ourselves from Him, not the other way around. And so oftentimes I think we find ourselves saying, where is God? Where was God in this instant or in that circumstance? But we see here from David's account, that He's always there. And that's never changed. That never will change. It is something that we have to recognize. Getting into some application here, particularly in this section, these first 12 verses, knowing all that we know here, I think that we've read Psalms like this throughout various times of our lives. We know some of these things. Why is it, though, that we so often still feel alone in our own lives, in quiet moments of desperation? Why? Not a rhetorical question either.
Elliot, I think sometimes that might be due to the fact that it's hard for us to accept that even though somebody knows us, the good and the bad and all that stuff, that they would still want to know us. We know our worst, and so it's hard to accept that even though he knows all that about us, he still is with us, still there. And so we isolate ourselves because
Yeah,
we're ashamed.
definitely. Right, what you're hitting on is, right, some aspect of guilt too, right, with understanding our own corruption, our own fallacies. Definitely, I think there's some of that there.
Yeah, and to that point, I think some of the loneliness is self-inflicted, kind of like to that point, because we hold on to that and we don't bring it to God. And we've read Psalms this class, even so, like where someone's speaking to God, and I think Brian had a class where it was like almost a little bit like, okay, calm down. The writer was getting pretty aggressive, but he was still bringing it to the God of his salvation. And so these Psalms and what we're reading today tell us how we should look at God, and the loneliness that we might feel is because we are holding on to those things and not bringing it to the God of our salvation, and we feel like isolated and we need to bring it to him who can protect us and save us.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. So many times it's self-inflicted. To your point, we live in a more connected world now than ever. When you think about digitally the things that we have at our fingertips, you think about physically the infrastructure that we have through highways, roads, vehicles, just the mass amount of connectivity that we have in today's world versus just call it, the last generation, 100 years ago. And yet we are more alone probably as a people, I would say, than maybe ever before. You do a number of different studies. I know they did this during the pandemic, but rates of abuse of alcohol and drugs and things have skyrocketed. There's a number of people that have just sweeping issues mentally and are just struggling at a very broad level. But yet we have more connectedness, I guess if you could say that, than ever. And I think that's exactly indicative of what you're talking about, right? So often it's self-inflicted.
Just kind of to touch on that, we feel super vulnerable when our life is displayed for the world to see. And so we hold back, and we see this in this filtered world that we live in. We put our best foot forward, but we don't tell our deep, dark secrets. And part of this psalm really lets us know, like, we're not alone because God knows us. He searched us. He pursues us. And he's still, because he knows everything about us, he's still doing all these things. That should be comforting. Whereas if we're with a friend or, somebody else, we hold on to the truth of who we really are sometimes because we're embarrassed or, and then we feel alone because we don't feel known. But God knows us and loves us, and that's a comfort. And David, who wrote this, and kind of to Randy's point, it's a blessing. He points out it's a blessing that he knows us like he does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of these comments makes me think about the semester Julie and I spent in England in 2014. We went to a church, and a young woman there kind of gave me a testimony about how the church there had helped her so much. She said, I was living in a city of 10 million people, but I felt totally alone in this community of Christians. And I think that's partly taking advantage of the things God has set up for us, communities of Christians. The other example, I don't know if some of you have heard me use this before, so I apologize up front, but Satan, I think, even if we see in Genesis 3, he wants to separate us from God. He wants to separate us from each other. It's a divide and conquer thing. I know there's a scene I keep quoting from Harry Potter, a great biblical book, but where Harry is expressing that nobody gets it. Nobody really understands. Because my parents and he's becoming friends with Luna, who says, well, I don't think that's true. I think many people are with you, and I've gone through this. But I know in my life, even people sometimes who've gone through hard things, maybe a death of a close relative or spouse, will sometimes tell other people who are now going through this. People will say things to you, but they don't really get it. I don't think they realize that that's the exact opposite of what is helpful. Because what they're telling them is you should feel isolated, you should feel alone. I mean, I know that like you said, this sort of self-inflicted, because pain and suffering and trial in many ways is very personal, our tendency is to just make it even more, personalize it to the nth degree, rather than seeking out God, seeking out others. And it's a very interesting question, and I think Psalms really, the whole collection of it sort of speaks to not holding it in, not self-inflicting this isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something that I had down as well. It's a very interesting thought, which is when we believe that our issues and our problems are more unique than anybody else, and that nobody else can comprehend them, nobody else can relate to them or associate with them, that is nothing more than masquerading as a self-inflicting way to isolate ourselves. And today I think we often want to boast in the amount of differences or uniquenesses that we have as individuals, and certainly there's some things to maybe be said about that, but really we're no different today than people 100, 200 years ago. We go through the same thoughts, the same feelings. They may have different applications and they may manifest themselves in different ways, but they are no different.
Yeah, to quote Luna, she says, I think Voldemort wants you to think that way. You're weaker if you're isolated. Well, it struck me, you could stick in the name of the devil and it works right there. He wants us to feel isolated when we're going through hard things. He doesn't want us to sense God's presence around us and with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we succumb to that, I think, and if he succeeds in allowing us to feel that way, we might feel some small victory in maybe feeding our pride or our ego, and that we have some untypical problem or character trait. But ultimately, we've lost the war, I think, at that point, in allowing him to isolate us, allowing him to make us, vulnerable to his attacks. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you raised your hand. Anything else? Any other ideas?
I was kind of thinking about darkness and what he says here at the end of this section we just read, kind of, surely darkness shall cover me and the light about me be night. Like when we're thinking about our own sin, a lot of sins are done in the dark and in the night. But I think it's a helpful reminder for us that to God it's just like it was daytime.
Yeah.
And so, when we're tempted in the nighttime or any time in our life to sin or go astray, it's really helpful to remember that God is present in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. The one last thing I want to touch on is that I had down is we can also feel this way when we have the wrong priorities, right? And this is something we've talked about, I think, oftentimes, and maybe this is another symptom of self-infliction to some degree. To some degree, right? It's all our actions that create some of these issues. But when we choose to push him out, and we choose to not spend time focusing on God, meditating on him, praying to him, that leaves us feeling that same way. Moving on, let's go ahead and read verses 13 through 16 here. Dylan, would you mind reading verse 13 through 16?
For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them.
This is such an interesting collection of verses here. I don't think I've ever mused and said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I've thanked God many times for the fact that I have 2 legs to walk, that I'm able to breathe, that I'm able to see and, do all the 5 senses sorts of things. But David is just so much more of a poet, certainly than I am. I hated English class in high school. But he's very good at getting us to, I think, appreciate the everyday things that God's given us in a way that we maybe struggle to do today, or maybe are not as appreciative of. And we see him transitioning here now to talk about the process of birth, right? And some of the things that God's able to know, God's able to understand. He says that his eyes have seen my unformed substance. In your book were all written, the days that were written to me. We know much more today about the process of how babies are formed. We know much more today medically about how that process works. And yet David here maybe wasn't able to understand all those medical complexities, but he was able to appreciate the fact that God had some omniscience, God had some understanding way above his, before his eyes were able to see. He was able to understand, as if a book had been written already about David's life, everything that was going to unfold before he came out of his mother's womb. I think that's just so powerful for us to understand. God could see what man could not see, I think. And David certainly appreciates that throughout most of his Psalms. And he knows at the end of the day what the end of our story is going to be. He knows what our days are going to look like, even before we do. Any thoughts or comments on this particular section before we move on to the next few verses?
I think it's just, really neat. God could have made robots. We know that's not how love works, and we're not going to just be programmed to be forced to obey or do anything like that. But instead, right here, David reminds us that not only are we not robots, but each one of us are made unique and set apart from each other, and that God has that intimate relationship with us, each one of us, and that's a pretty cool thing that he makes us different.
Yeah,
Special.
God wanted to give us the choice of free will, right? He wanted us to be able to decide for ourselves what to choose. And that's something that we should appreciate. I've had friends in the secular world so often say, why give us the thought if we were, doomed, for all humanity? But I don't see it. I don't think that's right. God wanted to give us the ability to choose. God loves us. He didn't create us to be under his oppression. He created us as a gift. I definitely agree with that. Moving on to verses 17 through 24 here. Let's go ahead and read 17 through 24 through the end of it. Nick, would you read that? Thanks.
How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you, God, would slay the wicked, away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting.
So there's a lot in these last 7 or so verses, and we're going to kind of cherry pick a couple of things. And if you have some other thoughts you'd like to share, please definitely share them. But the middle section of this collection of verses here, David transitions to start talking about the wicked and men of bloodshed. He makes a couple of comments saying that, that you, God, would slay the wicked. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against you wickedly. Why do you think he transitions from this psalm of just utter praise and magnitude in how he was created, the birth process, all of that, to now condemning the wicked and these people? Why the change in tone?
I think you see it in the next verse when I think he takes great offense that there are people who would drag God's name through the mud, so to speak, and not give him the credit that he is deserving from what David has said up to this point. And David is almost taking up arms with God to say, do something to these people because you deserve everybody's honor and praise, and not everybody's giving it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we're saying this out loud, I'm remembering, I think a couple classes ago, there was a similar point that we made in another psalm that I covered, and I think it just definitely shows the connectedness of all these psalms. David is so passionate in terms of his love for God that he cannot stand to be around or associate with people that do not share that same passion. And definitely people that actively rebel against God, those that hate God. And he's not mad because they hate or rebel against him. It's because they rebel against his creator, the person that he loves the most, more than anything. And I think it really highlights and shows us David's heart, to be a man after God's own heart. That is what this looks like. The language that David uses here and the intensity that he has, and the low zero tolerance that he has for people that have the opposite, opinion, I think is displayed here.
We talked about this Paradise last year. I think it's one of the most difficult in some ways for us to navigate. Because even within the Psalms, we've seen these Psalms where he says, Lord, if you kept a record of sins, who could stand? He recognizes his own sin and his own reliance on grace. And it is easy to think, well, then I could never condemn anyone else. Well, that's not who God is. It's not who a man after God's own heart is. And often we fall into a ditch on either side that we think grace means it can never have any negative view toward evil and evildoers. And on the other hand, sometimes we, especially I think maybe historically in our world of churches, we maybe become hyper judgmental. We run to passages like this and we sometimes forget that, well, if you kept a record of sins, none of us would be standing. And balancing those two and thinking, and it's not as easy as we sometimes come up with little mantras like, well, hate the sin but not the sinner. Well, that's not what's coming out here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So where is that line is the question, That's more of a rhetorical one. I know that's pretty tough to answer. Absolutely, I think you're right. And I think that's something that we see here with David and his tone. Okay, let's keep moving. We see David now ends this particular psalm asking for his intentions and for his heart to be searched. I think it's so beautiful in the description that he uses here to basically ask God if there's anything in me that maybe I don't know or understand that could be sinful in some way, that could be impure, that could come across as not what David's trying to display here in these words. He's asking him to know his anxious thoughts, know if he's done anything that's been hurtful in any way. David just has such a sublime passion for being pure, I think, in this particular psalm. And it's something that I certainly take from this as wanting to model in my own prayer life when I'm ending prayers. I think it's something we can all take in how we talk to God on a regular and daily basis. Any other thoughts or comments on this psalm before we move on and go to Psalm 141?
Elliot, both of these psalms are great examples of communication.
Yeah.
And I think about communication between myself and Natalie, and she can comment on that too. But that's always been, as a guy, it might be harder for guys such as myself to be a good communicator. You see the power of good communication here, and what an example. And to have, some vulnerability, or to be able to say, hey, as he says here at the end, tell me if something is wrong. That you see and picture that in relationships, in marriages, in any type of relationship, and it completely changes it.
Oh, we gotta take a minute now. I totally agree with this. Here's some free advice from a 28-year-old, right? At the end of the day. I love that idea, and I can tell you, growing in communication, if we're looking at the Psalms and using that as our guide, one, it's, I think, less combative. It's much easier, right, to look at something that we can read and talk to God versus talking to another person, right, particularly our spouse. But I have grown so much just in the last several years from reading passages like this and trying to apply the principles that David is taking in his communication to other areas of my life. And I think that's a great point. That wasn't even something I was thinking of, but that's exactly why I ask these kinds of questions, because I think it's so eye-opening. Okay, Psalms 141. We don't even have time to read any of it. This is really a prayer of David to guard his heart. He's wanting to continue kind of some of the thoughts that he has in Psalms 139 here. But we also see some other applications, particularly in how we can pray today. David starts out by asking, "O Lord, set a guard over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips," in verse 3. And we see him continue some of the thoughts that he had in Psalms 139, particularly at the end of that passage. And it continues David's expression of wanting to be pure, wanting to have the right intentions, wanting to be held in the right regard before God. We also see then in verses 4 through 6, he condemns.
Since you teach kindergarten, a 2-year-old, so say someone's teaching the 2 and 3-year-old class, how long is it? 2 minutes? They can only attend for 2 minutes, like with their attention span?
I definitely think that comes with knowing your kids and the expectations that you set at the beginning. There are times where, I mean, my 5-year-old kindergartners, I mean, sometimes they will sit for 30 minutes while but it depends on what you're doing on the carpet. Like you can shift what you're doing. You can randomly start singing what you're saying. You know, it just depends on what you're doing as the teacher. But definitely for those, smaller ones, 2s and 3s, they're going to need to move. I mean, come to the carpet, sing a song. All right, let's stand up. Let's go to our seats. And then, do a small snippet. Let's stand up. Let's go to the carpet. If just going back and forth like Laura and Mindy were saying earlier. But the 2s and 3s for sure